Welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to welcome you to the Equitable Compensation Practices Trends and Misses webinar. And today we will cover how to ensure compensation fairness and equity and the value in offering transparency and training around pay practices, decisions, and market position. I'm Cura HR's VP of Consulting Services, and I oversee our business development and marketing functions. Joining us today are panelists Lissa Hansard and Lindsay Satula. Lissa is an experienced HR consultant and the founder of Cura HR, where she leads her team in the development of standards and best practices in design and implementation of people processes and programs covering all facets of HR. Cura works with hundreds of businesses across all industries. Lissa's discipline of focus has been in compensation for over 20 years, and she enjoys engaging with clients on solving these complex challenges. Lindsay is the founder and CEO of Top Fox Marketing, an award-winning digital marketing agency based in Boulder, Colorado, with clients throughout the US. They specialize in brand building, market strategy, website development, and content creation. Top Fox Marketing has been Cura's marketing agency of record for the past year and a half. Before I turn it over to our presenters, I have a few housekeeping items. We'd be happy to field your questions throughout the presentation, so as they arise, feel free to type them in the chat or the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer them as they come in. Otherwise, we will answer any final questions at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to our presenters, Lissa and Lindsay.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to jump in with our very first question of the day, which is, Lissa, why is equitable compensation important right now?
Sure. So transparency laws are driving attention and increasing pay equity audits and causing employers to react and try to be more proactive about pay equity in general, speaking to it and addressing it internally. But the change in practices that we've been seeing and the decisions that we're experiencing seem to be coming more from social shifts. So leaders actually looking at their data and listening to their employees and their managers and their peer groups and wanting to make changes to remedy inequities and reduce the risk, not just the legal risk, but actually of losing good talent that they don't want to lose. So really, I think it's just more awareness in general is driving attention to it and making it more important today. And then second, there is, again, on this social shift, there is some online pressure and social to address the rub between historical practices and new views on pay. So historically, pay increases have been predominantly, or pay differentiators have been predominantly explained by performance and by experience. Well, with flat pay budgets or relatively flat pay budgets and compared to inflation for decades now, we have this shift in compression. And so historical practices aren't really keeping up with the market. And then you add on to that the criticism of even considering years of experience in making pay differentiation decisions. It is a valid compensable factor, but you'll see job postings on LinkedIn and Indeed getting slammed by some generation saying that why should I be paid different than or paid less just because of my years of experience if I have the same skill set and can do the same job. Never mind if there are any differences in the application of those skills, if I'm capable of doing it, why should there be a difference? And finally, there's one kind of big thing that I think we don't talk about enough, and that is the rate of change in people's jobs. I think between new technology changes and reorgs and kind of constant changes in the market environment, we're seeing a lot of just my job's changed conversations that are causing this attention to, so how is it equitable now that it's changed?
Interesting. Compression seems to be a hot topic in the market today. It's something that we hear a lot. Can you explain a little bit about what pay compression is?
Yeah, so pay compression is the reduction in the gap between pay levels for any series of jobs. So imagine an experienced, consistently performing employee is paid relatively the same as an employee who was just hired and doesn't have any experience in the same job, or even at a lower level job. So it's a compensation issue that either develops in large part over time or in specific situations overnight. So typically between a newly hired employee and a tenured employee in the same job, or between managers and their direct reports. It's a symptom that indicates something isn't working in the pay systems of an organization.
What usually contributes or leads to that pay compression?
Some of the same reasons that lead to inequity. So a tighter labor market, pay budgets not keeping up with the supply and demand of labor in the market, higher rates of job changes. It's hard to find a real solid data point on this, but I've seen anything from people leaving jobs every 1.4 years on average to every 6 years on average. In general, those rates continue to be reported faster. So it seems that there is a legitimate kind of loyalty tax, as people say. The longer you're at an employer, the less your increases. You're going to find bigger jumps if you're jumping jobs more frequently. And then there is an effective minimum wage. And I don't mean to say anything negative about increasing minimum wage. That's not my intention here. But the reality is that as minimum wages hike occur, we see employers, the average employer who employs all levels of staff, saying, okay, well, I want to be more competitive than the non-skilled or trained labor in the market. And if I don't increase all of my levels, there is some natural compression occurring. And then finally, the one that we pay the most attention to is just inconsistent practices. So you're going to get compression if every manager is making decisions differently, using a different set of criteria. If the organization isn't actually defining pay based on consistent methods and practices, and it creates confusion and disloyalty.
Interesting. Yeah. So what should someone do about that? Can you start with some long-lasting solutions? Do you have any advice to offer for handling compression and equity within organizations?
Yeah, there are the big ideas that are a bit more complex, and are really driven by each unique organization. So everyone has a different strategy and value proposition and budget constraints. And so I really recommend that employers start by getting really clear on the big things. So instead of not having a total rewards philosophy or employee value proposition defined, spend time on that at a macro level. What is the ecosystem of rewards that you're offering as an employer that connects with your company's purpose and mission? What are your pay practices? Like realistically, not aspirationally, but what are you actually doing today? And what do you need to keep and throw out, and then stick to those decisions? So what's the decision criteria that's being used to make pay decisions? What are the factors that you believe go into it? Is it performance? If so, double down on that. Talk about performance every single week and make sure that that's something that then when you go to talk about how it connects to pay, it's all aligned. Is it career level? Do you have good differentiators defining the different career levels? Is it tenure? Do you care about particular skills or capabilities that add value to your organization's business value chain? Are those the things that you want to define your pay practices around? So in my opinion, it's really about getting clear on these things so that you're able to actually make consistent decisions and use consistent language to describe them. The final thing that I'll say is job architecture. I think a lot of people think that if they have pay structures or an org chart that handles it, and or job descriptions. Our experience is that having a really differentiated job architecture that addresses different professional tracks, different skill requirements, competency requirements, scope of the job, operating levels that exist will really ensure that you can claim to make decisions based on evaluative criteria that's tied to the job. We see orgs redefining org department changes and reorgs happening all of the time. So a really valid job architecture should be able to withstand that. And so getting really clear on it helps as you're even evaluating your workforce strategies and reorgs.
That all sounds like it's a very time-consuming approach. Is there anything that's a more immediate solution in the short term?
Yes, I think the very first step should just be looking at your data. So learn what's actually happening around pay and people. So we hear all of the time and see in reports that are valid that reported pay increase budgets have been flat. They've been ranging from 3 to 5% for decades now. However, we have over 300 clients and we consistently see actual comp changes in the double digits. So what's actually happening in the org. So look at your numbers and consider communicating that instead of just your merit or COLA budget. Look at your promotion rates, your internal mobility rates, your turnover, your tenure, your percent of new hires. All of these things that make up workforce analytics actually affect what's happening with your pay. And if you start talking about that information, it's a much more interesting story to employees than, oh, I'm just, our budget's 4% this year. We consistently surprise our clients when we present to them the data that we've uncovered and the analytics that we've uncovered in working with them. Their data tells a story and it helps when you communicate it to employees. A couple of other near-term things and immediate things that we're seeing people do. So one, market price and adjust pay structures. We saw employers kind of pause on doing that type of work at the beginning of COVID. I think that we're seeing the swing and the uptick of redoing market analysis and updating their pay structures and market ranges. It's a good practice and a good way to establish some norms around your practices. And then finally, conduct a pay equity audit. The regression analysis that you get out of a real pay equity audit is going to give you really interesting information about pay gaps after accounting for what you expect the pay criteria is. So after accounting for performance and experience and career level and similar job groups. And it's a really helpful way to understand your current relationship between your pay decisions and what might need to change.
Got it. Let's go back to that communication, if you don't mind. You emphasize that quite a bit. How would you go about that? And what's the value in transparency and training for pay equity?
Yeah, so I'll answer the how first. I think that it is really important in terms of communications and training around compensation to ensure that it's starting from the top so that you rough out or smooth out all of the rough messages and all of the confusion early on so that leaders all the way down to people managers and employees feel a lot more comfortable talking about compensation. So creating some norms around how and when we talk about it and do it more frequently. Build in the practice of talking about compensation and or job expectations and performance a lot more regularly. That can be done. That can be done in one-on-ones, that can be done in group training. I would suggest, for the sake of change enablement, doing it in a lot of different ways in a lot of different venues and having it affect everything, every area of the employee life cycle rather than just a one-time training. The real value in transparency and training is trust and loyalty. You may not retain everyone you want to retain when you become more transparent and share everything, but it does preemptively require that you have some pay practices to communicate and train on. So it sets the stage for we actually have a criteria and method for making decisions. It doesn't mean that those practices won't change over time as you refine things, or that everyone will like them, but at least it creates a consistent practice to combat inequity and to give confidence to your managers in talking about this stuff. There's a lot of value in giving managers language that everyone is consistently using to describe what it means to get promoted, what type of increases are available, the different types of promotions and or pay adjustments, and why an individual is paid what they are. And then finally, of course, there is to get ahead of legislation with the basics. So 17 states have pay transparency laws or statutes. 42 states have equal pay regulations to be addressing pay gaps and establishing practices that ensure equitable pay decisions is just the right thing to do and protects both your reputation and your risk in the long term.
Got it. What is the most important miss you see employers make around pay equity and retention?
Probably there's kind of two go hand in hand. So get proactive with your talent. So managers should know where their people are in terms of their level of commitment and their interest, and they should be anticipating potential exits. So the miss we see is that we get to the point where employers are being held hostage or feel like they're being held hostage by unfair compensation demands. Ideally, we set our managers up by training them on how to be more proactive and engaging with their talent and understanding what their needs are in terms of stretch opportunity or if they're undercompensated. But as an alternative, the miss we see is that they don't, and we end up retaining people who ultimately are just dissatisfied with their pay and are going to leave anyway. We would recommend consider letting attrition happen when given ultimatums, and really trying to proactively address inequities early rather than allowing it to get to the point where you feel like you're being held hostage.
That's great information. What kinds of projects are your clients taking on in 2023, and what should you be doing?
Yeah, probably the four big ones as it relates to compensation and pay equity specifically are, I'll list them all and then get a little more background. So job architecture, market analysis, pay equity audits, and performance management, actually. So from a job architecture perspective, we're really seeing there have been so many job reorgs and changes over the last 3 to 4 years. We're really seeing people double down on the design of the job architecture so that it isn't any longer based on just the org structure or titles, but on levels and distinct practice areas and competencies. And we're working with our clients to get really specific in the definitions to provide clarity for employees on what they need to achieve and experience to progress. So it's a little bit less tied to the way the org looks today and more tied to level and function and scope. Around market analysis, I mentioned earlier, we're just seeing a lot of companies come back to refreshing market data and redesigning their pay structures after leaving it for a couple of years and just making minor adjustments. And then pay equity audits for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, completing the analysis in time to incorporate the results and the outcomes into comp practices, not just in time for year end, but in time for recruiting, in time for knowing where your gaps are for mid-year adjustments and promotion decisions, and even incentive design. And then the last one, performance management, I find really interesting because we're finding businesses have long done performance management. We haven't seen a slowdown in the desire to redesign their performance management practices and implement new solutions. So first, building job architecture into expectations and the evaluative process, defining criteria for for how performance specifically ties to pay changes and when. You can have a lot of people performing and not be able to justify promoting or increasing everyone's pay. So establishing criteria that works for the business tied to performance, instituting and facilitating calibration at all levels of management is something we're seeing a lot more of now. And if you're far enough along, for those of you who are far enough along with pay equity, running regression analysis prior to calibration. So your HR team has the pay gap information in front of them, and they can ensure that they're helping make really informed decisions about where your limited budget dollars are going.
Excellent. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. The first is compression directly contributing to pay inequity?
It's another outcome of inconsistent pay practices, but we can't necessarily say that compression, that where there is compression, there is inequity in pay. No.
Excellent. And just as a reminder, if you do have any questions, go ahead and send them in the chat. We have a couple more, but happy to field any questions from the audience. So next question is there a current differential that people should target for pay at an advanced level versus entry to combat compression?
Oh, no, there's no exact rate for this. It depends on the number of levels in an organization, the size of the organization, the scope of jobs in the organization, the current market supply and demand, and the particular talent that's needed, existing pay structures, and the organization's job architecture. So there isn't an exact rate, but even without a formal pay structure or design, there are natural hierarchies and job matrices that drive these differences and should be paid attention to. So ideally, you're doing market analysis regularly and looking at market data. If you're not looking at market data, maybe just looking at your internal differentials and saying, does this feel appropriate given what we know we have to pay for these jobs and where our people are today?
Yeah, you mentioned market data, and inflation also comes up, and we do have a question about inflation, and it continues to come up in a lot of pay discussions, especially when it comes to pay increases and things like that around the year. How are employers responding to this, and what should we consider as ways of addressing the significant increase to cost of living, especially in certain areas?
My first piece of advice is to acknowledge that it's real. Don't try to argue with employees about it. There are varying views on this. And reporting being done on inflation and the effect to employees today. So I don't think getting into that is valuable. I think you just say, yes, the real cost of goods have increased, and on average, they don't go down. So how an organization actually takes responsibility for it, I don't know if they can. I wonder if there's value in being honest enough to say, we have budgets that we have to attain to, and we hear you, and we know it's real. We are seeing some of our clients implement inflation stipends, which are short-term solutions to the pressure of inflation and the inability to spend long-term commitment on increased salaries at the level that they would like to. So instead, implementing these inflation stipends that are small amounts with every paycheck that go up or down. Now, there is an expectation that these are removed at some level. However, I haven't seen specifically what measures are being used to evaluate a point when the stipend is removed, or how they would even get to a catch up. So there are challenges with that. Yeah. We are seeing employers also reinvest in short-term incentive or bonus plans that were either maybe stagnant or even taken away or rolled into base pay at some point in time to make up for the lower pay rates. over the last few years and compared to inflation. So we're seeing employers relook at that as a way of saying, okay, as we meet or achieve these certain targets, then we can reinvest in higher income. But there's also just a reality that I think I mentioned earlier, last year, the average budget increase, pay budget increase was around 4% across the country. And what we actually saw is that pay budgets increased anywhere from 11 to 25%, at least in the data that we have access to on actuals. That's not just our client base, but also other reported actuals are running in the double digits. So it's not, maybe doesn't feel like we can keep up with the increased cost of goods, but there is movement in pay in the market.
Excellent. Another question from the audience: what is the current rate increase for small businesses under 20 employees for 2023 with that current rate of inflation?
Pay rate increase, I'm assuming, is what they mean.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the average reported budget is 4%. That is not what we've seen. So we are typically seeing more in the double digits, even in our small employers. I think last year, the lowest number we saw in actuals, I may not get this exactly right, but I want to say it was 9 or 11%.
Are there any other questions from the attendees? Speak now, if you're ever, won't you please? Well, actually, Sarah, do you want to jump back in? I know that we have some contact information if someone has a question and they don't want to ask it here within the webinar.
Absolutely. Let me just share my screen again. I wanted to just cover what we had talked about as kind of a big picture topic. So we talked a bit about job architecture, total rewards philosophy, promotion criteria, pay management practices, the concept of talent calibration, pay equity audits, and workforce analytics. So certainly feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or want to talk about these topics in further detail. You can always reach out to us at hello@curahr.com, and we'd be happy to answer any other questions that you've thought of. I know this was a lot of information, so happy to answer anything in more detail when you're ready. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We will be sending out a recording tomorrow and look forward to hearing from anyone who has questions. And thanks again for your participation.
And Sarah, just to butt in one more time, we did get one more question from the audience. Can you talk a little bit more about pay equity and what criteria do you use to evaluate it?
Yes. So that depends on the organization. The primary, and it also depends if you're in Colorado or not. So although I would argue that the same criteria is really relevant, even if you're just responding to an OFCCP audit as a government contractor. So we would first start with pay groups. So what are your similar pay groups, which is why job architecture is so valuable. If you have defined any kind of structure that isn't just based on job title or department, it really helps in the definitions of similarly situated pay groups. So that's the first step and the actual requirement in being able to group jobs together and or people's pay together. Then what you look at is dependent on what the organization says they define, they use to define pay. So, and what's allowed to define pay. So non-discriminatory things, right? So years of experience, tenure at the organization, performance level. You have to be able to say that you have a way of evaluating performance level and using that criteria and making decisions. But those are the most common. We have used other things like competency evaluations and skill tracking, but you have to, again, an organization has to actually have that information and track it for us to evaluate it and determine whether those things are being used actually to make pay differentiation. And then the result of that pay audit is what the gap is. And we're typically evaluating that cap against the protected class factors that are required.
Excellent.
Although
Thank you.
we can do it on other things as well, but that's typical.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your time today. And again, if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Sarah. It was hello@curahr.com, correct?
hello@curahr.com. Yes.
Fantastic.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.